I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Foundation for Teaching Economics webinar called Cap and Trade Environmental Injustice. Today's webinar will discuss solutions to address climate change, such as California's Cap and Trade program, and if these programs work as intended. My name is Lisa Chang, and I manage the FTE's program operations and teacher programs. My colleague Molly Verdorn is also on with me. And it's our pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Danae Hernandez-Cortes. Professor Hernandez-Cortes is an assistant economics professor at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, and she teaches in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and School of Sustainability. She joined ASU from the University of California at Santa Barbara, where she received her doctorate in economics with an emphasis in environmental science. We are very grateful to her for giving today's presentation. A recording of this webinar, along with Dr. Hernandez-Cortes' slide deck, will be posted on the FTE website in a day or two. So please check back there for that. After her talk, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Please use the Q&A feature to submit a question. Feel free to upvote questions if you would like. And following the webinar, we ask that you complete a short evaluation on today's presentation. So, Professor Hernandez-Cortes, feel free to go ahead and start.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lisa, for introducing me, and Molly for helping us in the technical side of things. And thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to present my research. And let me just start sharing my screen. There we go. I think you can see it, right? Perfect. Okay, so I am very, very excited to be presenting this paper that has recently been published in the Journal of Public Economics. And in this paper, what we're interested in analyzing is whether environmental markets can cause environmental injustice. And as Lisa mentioned, we are focusing in California's carbon market. And I will explain why we're focusing in California's carbon market in a couple of minutes. But let me just begin by introducing the topic of environmental justice. And I know that many of you know a lot about these environmental justice issues, but let me give you a little bit of background about what we consider environmental injustice. So we know that it's very well documented that polluted places are also poorer and have more minorities. So for example, if you look here to the left in this left figure, you will see different census tracts. So all of this map is a census tract map. And you will see different levels of per capita income, as well as and these little circles that you will see have all of the TRI facilities, which are the toxic release inventory facilities. And as you can see here, most of the facilities that have these circles are also located near areas that have low per capita income. This is not only the case, this is the case of North Carolina, but this is not only the case in North Carolina, it's the case in many other areas. So for example, here to the right, you will see the pollution distribution and who is being affected the most by pollution. And so if you have the pollution levels and you divide it by who's more affected by it, either white populations or Black populations, what you will be able to see is that the higher pollution levels are experienced by Black populations. Whereas for white populations, it's roughly constant across population, but relatively lower the more pollution we have. So this is very well documented in many areas of research, but it has been particularly documented in the area of environmental justice research. For example, in the case of California, I know that some people in California here today, we see that if you correlate the poverty levels together with PM 2.5 levels, you will see that those communities that have the highest level of poverty also have the highest level of PM 2.5. This leads us to suggest as well that it's not only income or race, but it's also other levels of disadvantage, such as poverty. And this has been documented in several instances throughout the US. This means that low income poorer populations and also communities of color are exposed to higher pollution levels compared to other communities. And this is not new at all. So for example, in 1978, Dr. Robert Bullard published this paper, which was Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality, that started to compile some of the stories behind this pollution exposure. So what happened in many areas of the South was that some of these were exposed to more pollution, and Dr. Robert Bullard, who's the father of environmental justice, started to compile all of those stories to create a narrative for how for environmental justice and how communities of color and low-income communities were exposed to more pollution. So none of this is new. However, there has been a recent interest in trying to reduce those existing gaps. And for all of you who are aware of the Inflation Reduction Act, part of that Inflation Reduction Act funds were purposely designed to try to benefit some of these communities that have experienced the largest burden of environmental in the US. So let's first just put everything into terms, and let me give you the definition of environmental justice according to the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. So according to the Environmental Protection Agency, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people regardless of their race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So what is this telling us? What this is telling us is that environmental justice will be achieved when no group experiences a disproportionate share of the policy's negative environmental consequences, but also when people have all access to the decision-making of policies that could benefit them in terms of air quality and other environmental amenities. How did we get here? So most of the environmental justice research has been trying to focus on some of these historical trends on environmental injustices. But recently, in several studies that have tried to understand how can we get out of this. And so in order for us to try to understand how we get out of some of these issues, in the case of the research of a lot of economists, they try to focus on a specific case example or policy that could allow them to shed light into some of the consequences of environmental policy for disadvantaged areas and how effective are those policies reducing environmental disparities. So for example, several papers have examined whether environmental inequities arise because polluters get away with locating near disadvantaged households. Other papers have focused in understanding whether disadvantaged households face unequal opportunities to public services that prevent them from having good access to environmental quality, such as parks or other physical amenities. And other research has also focusing on whether pollution policies disproportionately affect disadvantaged households. And at the aggregate level, likely all of these things are happening. However, how we do research in economics is that we try to study the consequences of a specific policies or a specific phenomenon to start to shed light on the solutions that can reduce those disparities. So in this, so today I am going to be talking to you about one specific policy that was not intended to reduce environmental disparities, but what we find is that it actually helped reduce some of those environmental disparities. Therefore, we're going to be contributing to the literature that studies the pollution policy, whether pollution policies disproportionately affect disadvantaged households. Okay. So let's get into that. So we're going to be examining, in the case of this, of our paper, we're going to be examining the consequences of one environmental market, which is the cap-and-trade program in California. And as many of you know, market-based policies have been used for many, many years. And when I talk about market-based policies, I talk about those policies that put an implicit price on pollution, such as a tax or a cap-and-trade program. So market-based policies have increasingly been used to address environmental problems such as fisheries, ecosystem service payments, and currently there's around 20% of global carbon emissions regulated under several environmental markets alternatives. Now, the key feature about markets is that they force a spatially reallocation of pollution, which at the same time, it lowers the overall cost of meeting an environmental objective because it's less costly than other policies, such as policies that force producers to get some sort of technology that they need to use. So markets, in a sense, it's cheaper for them to do it. So it lowers the overall cost of meeting an environmental objective. However, it could lead to relatively greater pollution exposure for disadvantaged communities because they can reallocate where pollution is occurring. This, therefore, raises a central tension, which is that the same market forces that we like from the perspective of economic efficiency, because it's lowering the regulation cost, can also create inequities in pollution exposure. So here, I always like to show this map because it shows you the extent of how environmental markets are distributed in the world. And as you can see, many countries have a market or a market in progress to regulate some of their greenhouse gas emissions. And these markets are very important to study, particularly from an environmental justice perspective, given that we see that low-income people and communities of color are exposed to more pollution. So understanding how markets can reallocate that pollution is really important. In this paper, we're going to be focusing in one specific market, which is the market for California's cap-and-trade program. Now, there have been environmental justice concerns surrounding markets. For example, there was the renewal of the European Union emissions trading system in 2013. There was also the Washington State carbon tax in 2016, and the Oregon State climate policy in 2019. However, California's cap-and-trade program has received a lot of environmental justice concerns. And why does that program have received those many concerns? Well, first, in the baseline, disadvantaged communities are exposed to relatively more local air pollution on average. And that we know it. That has been the case for many years. Now, in the case of this program, which was called AB 32, this program established the second largest greenhouse gas cap-and-trade program that began in 2013. Now, the environmental justice concern of that program is that the greenhouse gases cap-and-trade can widen the environmental justice gap. What does that mean? That some of these programs may create more pollution in disadvantaged communities. And this concern was very influential during the program development in 2011 and renewal efforts in 2017. So in this paper, we are going to try to understand whether this program had environmental justice consequences, in the sense that whether it increased environmental justice gaps or reduced them. So that is our research question. Did local air pollution exposure gap between disadvantaged communities and non-disadvantaged communities, which we will refer to as the environmental justice gap, change following the introduction of the greenhouse gas cap-and-trade program? And this can be a very hard to study question because it depends on the technology of the polluters, and also how is pollution being emitted together with greenhouse gas emissions. So in the case of this program, the cap-and-trade program regulated greenhouse gas emissions, which these greenhouse gases do not necessarily have any effects on health. However, at the same time that you emit those greenhouse gases, you can also emit other pollutants that could affect the health of communities. So in this paper, we're trying to understand whether the environmental justice gap increased as a result of the program or whether it decreased. And there are many factors that could be happening there. So in this paper, we're going to try to analyze what is happening and whether we see a decrease or an increase in environmental justice after the program. Okay, but to do this, it is very challenging. And there are two main challenges related to this question. First, we need to separate the effects of cap and trade on pollution emissions from other factors that can be affecting emissions. So for example, there could be some macroeconomic trends. Say we are in the post-recession after 2008 and after 2009. Maybe facilities are increasing productions as they are ramping up production as a response of the economic recession, or whether there are other climate policies in California, like the low carbon fuel standards or other policies that could be affecting those facilities. Our solution to this is to use a quasi-experimental research design. What does this mean? We're going to try to compare facilities that were regulated under cap and trade program versus facilities that were unregulated during the program before and after the program started. This will allow us to understand what is the exact effect of the program compared to not having a program. And there's another challenge, which I will illustrate using these figures. The second challenge is that we need to model how pollution travels in space. And it's very important to understand that when you are trying to implement an environmental policy, because pollution is not affecting communities the same depending on where they live. So for example, there have been two prevailing approaches for assigning pollution concentrations in the world. So for example, if you look here to the left, this is the first approach. In this approach, this little dot will symbolize my one polluting facility. These squares will symbolize communities. So this first approach, what it does is to assign pollution to the community where pollution was occurring. This is the first approach. The second approach is to assign pollution based on a circle and assume that the pollution is traveling uniformly in this circle. This is the second approach. However, pollution can travel in much more complicated ways. So for example, the actual transport of pollution can be really complicated. And if you see it here, you will see that that some communities will be more exposed to pollution based on whether they are upwind or downwind from from the regulated facilities. So our solution is to embed a pollution dispersal model into this quasi-experimental framework in order to understand whether the cap and trade program actually helped reduce pollution inequalities. Okay, and how are we going to do it? First, we are going to isolate the cap and trade driven emissions by comparing regulated facilities versus unregulated facilities before and after the program started. This will allow us to isolate the effects coming from the program uniquely without thinking about all of the other factors that could be happening at the same time. The second step will be to model the transport of emissions to exposure by using an atmospheric transport model where we located all of the facilities in California and calculated where pollution was traveling depending on the hour, the day, the month, and the year of the program. And finally, we're going to estimate the environmental justice exposure gap by comparing how pollution, the levels of pollutions between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged areas before and after the program started. This will allow us to estimate whether disadvantaged communities experience an increase or a decrease in pollution concentrations relative to non-disadvantaged communities. Okay, so this is our approach. And so how are we going to do it? Well, we are going to leverage some of the institutional design coming from the greenhouse gas cap and trade program. So let me give you a little bit of context about the program. So in 2006, California passed AB 32, which is a statewide greenhouse gas emission program that required to get emissions levels at the 1990 levels by 2020. This established the world's second largest greenhouse gas cap and trade program that covered 85% of statewide emissions from all stationary sources in the state. The key institutional features is that some facilities were eligible because they emitted more than 25,000 tons of CO2, and it started in 2013. Okay, so we're going to be using data from California's Air Resources Board. This is going to provide us with all of the emissions data from 2008 till 2017. Remember, the program started in 2012, which allows us to have years before and after the program. And it also provided characteristics of regulated and unregulated facilities, which ends up being very important because, as you can imagine, if you have a larger stack, the pollution will travel farther than if you have a shorter stack. So that is very important, and it's an input for our pollution transport model. We also use data of California's EPA disadvantage community, which designs disadvantage for all of those zip codes that contain all or part of a census tract with a Cal scheme above the 25th percentile. Okay, so what are our results? First, we show that after the cap and trade program started, we see a decrease in emissions coming from a decrease in emissions from the program. So here what you see, there was an increase in emissions before the program started. However, after the program started, we see a decrease in emissions, which is great. This is the pollutant that was regulated. Remember, the pollutant that was regulated was CO2. And what we see is that before the program started, we see an increase in emissions. However, after the program started, we see a decrease in emissions. Now, what happens to other pollutants that are co-produced at the same time that CO2? Well, we see something very similar. We see that at the beginning, they were increasing, but then they were decreasing after the program. And then the same happens for PM10. We see that pollution is increasing before the program and then decreasing after the program. We see the same for NOx. Emissions were increasing before the program and decreasing after the program, which is great because that means that there could have been some benefits in terms of reduced pollution in those disadvantaged areas. We see something similar for SO2, although it's a little bit more noisy. So I am not going to be talking a lot about SO2 because our results are a little bit noisy. But as you can see, overall, we see this trend. There is an increase in emissions before the program started. However, after the program started, we see this decrease in emissions. Okay, so our second step is then understand how this pollution coming uniquely from the program traveled across the space. And here, what you're going to be seeing is different maps that show the different levels of pollution exposure during that day. And if you're familiar with California, you will see that LA is around here. This is the Bay Area, and here you have San Joaquin Valley. And as you can see, based on these areas, you will see that the areas that are most polluted are the areas of Los Angeles, San Joaquin Valley, and the Bay Area. We see something similar for the case of PM10, something less similar, a little bit more concentrated in the case of NOx, and similar to the case of SOx. So in all of these are the different pollutants that we are studying. And as you are able to see, most of the pollution is occurring in the Central Valley of California, in LA, and the San Francisco Bay Area. Okay, so now we have how emissions change after the program, and we use our atmospheric transport model in order to model all of the pollution at the census tract, at the zip code level. So the next step for us is understand whether the environmental justice gap increase after the program or decrease after the program. And for us, we are going to understand that by looking at the differences between disadvantaged communities and non-disadvantaged communities before and after the program started. And here is our main result. As you can see, before the program, we see an increase on the environmental justice gap, meaning disadvantaged communities were experiencing a larger pollution exposure compared to non-disadvantaged communities. However, after the program started, we see the complete reversal of that trend. What this means is that disadvantaged communities actually benefited more from the program than non-disadvantaged communities. So what we see is that the environmental justice gap actually decreased, meaning that environmental justice increased during that period. We calculate that the percent change in the environmental justice gap was about 150%, which means a very big decrease in these disparities. Now, something very important that you should be able to tell by this is that the emissions are not, that the disparities are still there. So as you are able to see here, this is in terms of this y-axis is in terms of pollution levels in terms of disparities. And if you see pollution, these disparities decrease, however, they are not gone. Otherwise, they will be closer to zero. We only calculate that by the end of 2018, the levels of pollution disparities are similar to those in 2008. So pollution disparities, in fact, decreased. However, these are not gone. Disparities still exist due to this, still exist in these areas. So this is for the case of PM 2.5, and we see similar effects for the other pollutants. For example, we see a decrease for PM 10, we see another decrease for NOx, and we see another decrease for SOx. So in all of these cases, you see that we see the same pattern. Environmental injustice was increasing and then decreasing after the program started. And that happened with all of the pollutants that we examined, which that gives us a little bit of hope to think that these programs could be effective in reducing environmental disparities for disadvantaged communities. And it is important to consider them while thinking about the implementation of these wider climate policies. To emphasize that we do not find this effect, this is only an average effect, right? All of the graphs that I have shown you so far show average effects. However, when you look at the actual changes, especially, you will see that some areas actually received some increases in environmental injustices. So for example, in this map, we are plotting the percent change in exposure trend for all of the zip codes in California. And as you can see, anything that is red means that environmental gaps increased. Anything that is in blue means that environmental gaps decrease. And as you are able to see, some areas of the Los Angeles area are actually experience an increase in exposure trend, meaning that these zip codes are actually experiencing an increase in pollution as a result of the policy. However, on average, most of the zip codes that we examine are experiencing a decrease in environmental exposure, which is great. In terms of the environmental justice implications of the program. Finally, I would like just to show, I always like to show these types of graphs because we like to see how robust our effect is towards other assumptions. And we are, in this case, we are plotting the total effect. So a reduction means that it's actually reducing environmental disparities. And as you are able to see, the effect that we find is consistent to other assumptions, to other more flexible assumptions, such as changes in the pollution decay function and changes in the sample and so forth. But I always like showing this to show that our result is robust. And finally, what we like to understand at the last part is whether actually having to model these pollution concentrations made sense. So in the last part of the paper, what we try to show is whether this modeling seems right. So in this case, remember, I told you that there are two main approaches into how to assign pollution exposure. The first one is assuming that pollution is staying where it's emitted. And the second one is assuming that pollution is traveling uniformly, following a circle surrounding this facility. This is not what we did in this paper, but these are some of the approaches. And what we actually find is that looking at that is actually really important. So in the paper, we're able to show that looking at how we model it actually shows significant effects. Okay, so to conclude, California's greenhouse gas cap and trade program lowered the greenhouse gases and criteria air pollution emissions of the pollutants that we examined. And we estimate that between 2012 and 2017, cap and trade reduced emissions at about a 3 to 9% per year across greenhouse gases and air pollutants. This translated into 3.2 million tons of CO2 emissions abated across sample facilities. We also find that it reversed previously widening environmental justice gaps for all of the pollutants that we examined. And by 2017, we estimate that the environmental justice gap returned to 2008 levels. Our paper also demonstrates the importance of integrating pollution modeling with statistical techniques in order to examine the impact of these policies. However, I would also like to mention several caveats, and this is probably something that is very worth mentioning. First of all, in the case of California, the environmental justice gap effect only compares pre and post 2013. We are not comparing anything to, we're only comparing having a program versus not having a program. We are not comparing which policy could be better at reducing environmental disparities. We are only saying, well, it might help reduce environmental disparities. So that is important to consider. Our paper is very limited in that sense. We cannot tell which is the best policy to reduce environmental disparities. We can only say whether cap and trade program actually reduce disparities or not. So I would like to really emphasize the fact that the environmental justice gap is still there. So as you are able to see, the environmental justice gap reduced, but it is still there. It is not gone. So there's still more need to understand which policies can actually reduce environmental disparities and which policies may not, because environmental disparities still exist. Also, I want to emphasize that a full distributional analysis requires analyzing other outcomes besides the effects of the policy. So for example, what we really care about is the health outcomes of the families that are living in those areas. And so far, this paper hasn't done it. So understanding where those families live and what are their experiences and what are their diseases and their health outcomes is really important. It's also really important to understand the cost burden of the policy. So for example, whether this program had some impacts on employment or not. That is also very important. But more broadly, environmental markets may not always narrow the environmental justice gaps. And economists and other people, including policymakers and communities, need to understand which policies are those that are more likely to reduce disparities for disadvantaged communities. So we need to generally understand when market-based policies or any other policy narrows or widens environmental justice gaps. And finally, I would also like to emphasize that environmental justice problems need environmental justice policies. In the case of this program, we see that one policy that was not intended to reduce environmental injustices actually reduced them. However, it is important to consider that in order to fully address environmental injustice, we need to do policies that fully address environmental injustice, not expect that some policies will have effects on those on environmental injustices directly. With anything else to say, I would like to say thank you for staying here. I'm really looking forward to the comments, questions, and discussions. And thank you so much, Lisa and Molly and Ted, for organizing the seminar.
Thank you so much. That was very informative. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is, have any environmental justice groups pushed back against your research?
Yeah, and I would like to talk a little bit about this. So some of the work that when we presented some of this work to some environmental justice groups, we received a lot of comments regarding some of our methods. The first one I would like to emphasize is the unit of analysis. So in the case of our unit of analysis, we have only examined zip code level analysis. And a lot of environmental justice groups asked whether that would actually the best way of approaching the study of environmental injustice. There might be other ways that you could actually do it. So as a response to that, we improved our model to look at census tract level data, because they suggested that some of the zip codes that we have seen are actually very large, and looking at a community just based on their zip code might not be the best way to go. So that was a very good suggestion that we considered in our presentation, and we improved our work as a result of that. And of course, there are other methodologies that could be used in order to answer these questions that we are not considering. But we try to be very transparent about some of these caveats in our research, particularly the fact that environmental justice problems need environmental justice policies. So policies that support the correct involvement of minority communities, as well as the full accounting of all of the potential benefits and costs of the policies, are really important.
Okay, very helpful. There's a few other questions here. Do you consider cap and trade to be the best method for reducing air pollution?
So I don't think that we can say that based on this paper. So in this paper, we're only examining cap and trade versus nothing. And that it's very limited in that sense. I think that some of the other policies that could be helpful are renewable generation, also other policies that could limit the emissions from other facilities are very important. But what we see here is that carbon markets or policies that affect facilities that are very polluting are effective. So that is one important result. And also, I would like to related to that question. I didn't show it in this presentation, but there are more details in the paper, and I'm happy to talk more about those details. But our effect, if you look at this effect, the effect is actually larger when you consider the most polluting facilities, which leads us to believe that regulations that target the most polluting facilities are the ones that are more likely to have environmental justice co-benefits. So that is really important in the sense of a cap and trade program, because cap and trade program tries to reduce pollution the most from the most polluting facilities.
Okay, wow. Okay, Paul is also asking, how effective is the European Union cap and trade program, in your opinion?
Okay, so that is a very good question. The European Union ETS has been shown. I haven't studied the European Union emissions trading system, but it's the largest emissions trading system in the world. And one important thing about the European Union emissions trading system is that it has been a very long program. Now, there has been some evidence showing that that program actually incentivized reduction of pollution as well, but there hasn't been research showing that disadvantaged communities benefited out of that. So that is a very important area left for further research.
Okay, thank you. Barbara is asking, how can we use the pollution disbursement model for our area?
Oh, that I would like to, that is a very fun question. So for us to do it, we had to use we had to use a model that is called high split. That model, you basically give the model some coordinates, and the coordinates tells you where the pollution is traveling. Now, this model is very computationally intensive. However, there's another model called InMap, where you do something very similar. You just locate the coordinates, and it will give you a map on where pollution is traveling. So that is very, very good, because that will mean that you're able to actually link which facilities are the ones that are polluting the most to your community. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I am happy to talk more about it. So please send me an email, and I can show you how that can be implemented, which is very relevant for research and also very relevant for community health. If we're able to see which facilities are polluting the most, then we're able to go and complain to our local governments to have more strict pollution limits. So it's a very important tool as well.
Okay, thank you. If you could be sure to, I know your last slide had your email contact information on there, but yeah, anyone who would like to hear more about that, please do reach out to Professor Hernandez-Cortes.
Here's my email, so please feel free to email me if you have a question of it, if you want to learn more about that model.
Okay. Someone is also asking, I don't think we've asked this one before, would the benefits of implementing a carbon tax outweigh its cost? That is a great question. We cannot say much about that in our paper, but some research has shown that if you compare a cap and trade program, it's actually less costly than compared to other programs, such as a command and control policy. What do I mean by a command and control policy? Basically, the government telling you have to reduce by this much, or you have to acquire this technology. So there have been research showing that a cap and trade program could be less costly than these other two alternatives. But overall, those policies a policy such as cap and trade or carbon tax can be very costly politically, because many governments are not they do not like some of these policies, and sometimes they are very hard to implement. But I can tell you from the experience, I have also done some research in Mexico using the cap and trade program in Mexico, and what we have seen there is that actually some facilities actually prefer the cap and trade program because it gives them more flexibility in abatement options, and therefore can be less costly than other alternatives. Okay, thank you. Couple more questions. Why do you think that cap and trade reduces EJ gap?
Yes, that is a great question. So what we find here, our results can show that what we find based on our results is the following. So we find that overall, cap and trade reduces CO2 emissions, and it also reduces other pollutants directly. So that is the pollution that is directly emitted from the facility. Now, if you consider who is located near the most facilities, is very often the most disadvantaged populations. Therefore, if you see a reduction coming from this program in terms of emissions, then it's very likely that the reductions will be translated into decreases in concentrations in the most disadvantaged areas, meaning that directly by decreasing the emissions, environmental justice outcomes can be increasing.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Emily. Your research suggests that California's cap and trade policy does not negatively impact lower socioeconomic communities.
Correct.
So why are advocacy groups ignoring the most recent academic research?
So there are several issues coming with environmental justice concerns about California's cap and trade program. And where is my slide, my background slide? Here. And there have been several issues regarding that program that have been difficult. So the first one is that a lot of the program was developed without the community's output, meaning that some of these communities didn't have a saying into which program they will think that will help them the most. So that is a very important concern, given that, as I said before, environmental justice is not only that pollution is lower in disadvantaged areas, but also that communities have correct involvement and a saying into the policies that affects them. So that is one of the main concerns, is that California's cap and trade program had some issues during their implementation that did not fully incorporate some of the community's concerns. So that is a big concern. But as a result of that, there have also been other policies that can help address some of these concerns. So, for example, later after this cap and trade program was released, there was another bill called the AB 617 that actually required the location of monitoring of pollution monitors in disadvantaged areas, which was really important because when we started doing this paper, we had to do our full atmospheric transport model to understand where pollution was traveling, given that not many of these communities have a monitor to begin with. So knowing that and providing that information is the first step towards trying to reduce pollution so that communities can have, one, information about where pollution is and how it's affecting them, and two, to hold accountable those facilities. So that was also a really important concern that communities have before the program was implemented and was not addressed by this program. But other subsequent programs have tried to address those issues. Okay.
And we did have one more question, last question, and this was actually from one of our FTE colleagues. Should cap and trade programs be centralized in a world regulatory agency like the UN?
That is a great question. The first thing that I would like to emphasize is that a cap and trade program that is not fully accounting for all of the potential sources might be ineffective. So let's think about CO2. CO2 is a globally emitted pollutant. It affects all of us, not only the ones that are located near the facilities that emits them, but they affect all of us via climate change. So having a centralized, having a cap and trade program that is global could be effective, because that could help alleviate this issue that we need coordination among countries to have this program. So, for example, what happens if California regulates CO2, but those emissions are leaked somewhere else? Well, the program didn't have an impact to begin with. So a program that is centrally regulated by one entity that has authority over several countries, given that we all are affecting greenhouse gas emissions, could be effective. Now, politically, I would think that would be very hard to implement, but we have seen some programs that are designed to consider more than one jurisdiction, such as the European Union emissions trading system. So it might be possible to have it.
Okay, great, thank you. That's it with the questions. Thank you again, Dr. Hernandez-Cortes, for your time, and to everyone participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, please take a moment to give us your feedback on the brief follow-up survey, and a recording of the webinar will be posted on our website in a day or two. Molly, did you have sort of our upcoming programs slides ready to share? My colleague Molly will be sharing that momentarily, but if you would like to learn more about FTE and our programs and resources, visit our site at fte.org and check out all our upcoming programs. What you see now is some of what we've got coming up. There will be another webinar later on this month. And many teacher options, teacher programs this summer as well. So please feel free to go to the website. You can register through there. And thank you all for joining us, and have a great evening wherever you are.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I will go ahead and end this. Thank you.
Yes, bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.